Hello, Flute Methods. This video is all about the low register on the flute. Uh, so the first question, the range of the flute is approximately 3 octaves. We have usually think of it as low, middle, and high, or first octave, second octave, third octave. There's a little pad on either side. We're not going to cover the entire range of the instrument, but we will cover most of it. So I bring up the low register, and the reason I'm starting with the low register is because that's where you would start with a student. And you might just start by asking, why the low register? Why are we starting with that? And the reason is because the air is the slowest when you're in the low register. So it requires a little less control of the embouchure. You don't have to have these fine muscles, kind of, we talk about where the dry meets the wet, and right inside the lips, being able, that's what you use to really focus the airstream. And you don't need to be able to do that as much in order to play in the low register. It's a bigger air column. It can be challenging. Notice, the size of the hole is what it is, and it doesn't get larger because you're blowing a larger airstream. So it can be challenging to get the air to go into the flute in the low register. Some people struggle with the low register for that reason. So at any rate, I just want to make sure we're kind of clear on why we're starting there. And if lower is better, why not just start all the way at the bottom? That would be taking that concept to its logical conclusion. And the flute actually gets a little more resistant as you get down to the lowest notes on the instrument. So we generally try to start in about the middle of the low register. And there are plenty of books you'll see out there, method books, that start with the B or the B flat, depending on where they are. It's not a very resistant note. It's okay. The problem with that is, look how many fingers I don't have down. So it can feel a little unstable. Remember we talked, and I did that video on the hand position, and the fewer fingers you have down, the less kind of secure the flute can feel in your hands. It takes a while before this feels good in your hands. So I actually prefer to start with G. So, and remember, I'm going to remind you again that you can make like a little peace sign with your index finger and your middle finger and put it right there. Remember, there is this note. I don't have a sticker because I've played the flute for 30 years, but yeah, there's this one key you do not put your finger on. So that would be something you want to check with your beginners, because I can guarantee you, part of it also, keep in mind that they have tinier little hands, so they're going to be very tempted to kind of bunch their fingers together and get a little too high here. So we want to make sure. For me, it's about, if I put my two fingers on my other hand between those two fingers, that's about the amount of space that needs to be between them. So having more fingers down is good. Even if you're hopelessly right-handed like I am, it's still harder to play with two hands together than it is in one hand. So you might want to start with the notes that just stay in the left hand. It's a little bit less confusing that way. So I like G to start. And the B and the C can be a little bit tricky because you just don't have that many fingers down. So this would be a good time for your students to notice, I'm going to play again, I'm going to lift my fingers up really high. And the flute, you can try this too. The flute will feel like you're going to drop it. It really shifts the center of gravity a lot. So this is a great time for your students to perhaps look in the mirror and make sure they're not lifting their fingers very high off of the keys, because it'll keep the center of gravity just closer to the tube and you'll feel more secure. So I would always start with those notes, and when they're starting to feel pretty secure with that, you can make kind of, you can make her little exercises with those fingers until they get used to the idea of moving those fingers together. At that point, you can add your chromatic fingerings. I would really strongly urge you to start with what we call 1 and 1 on the B flat. So I'm going to show you, I'm not here, I'm here with my thumb. So, and then I'll add this. And so, yeah, I know that just violates the adding the right hand, but we are going to make things gradually a little bit more complicated. So, yeah, I think it's really important to distinguish between B flat and B without sliding the thumb. You can slide the thumb later. Yeah, so right now we just need to do that. And then when you get really comfortable with that, at that point you could go chromatic down, or you could just you could do the basics here. The basics actually make a little more sense because the sort of organizing acoustic principle for the flute is that as you put keys down, you're making the tube longer, and as the tube gets longer, then you get lower notes. So let me make sure you can see all the hands. All right. So I'm when I put this down, which I'm not going to recommend for you, I'm making the tube even longer. So that's the idea. It's a little less linear because when you play F sharp, we use this finger, but it's actually this key right here. We just don't have a finger over here to close that key, so we're using that key. So it seems a little less straightforward, and then E flat and D here. So I'm going to go ahead and play that chromatically and watch what happens here. So I'll make it so you can really see my right hand. So I know a moment ago I went lower than that. Honestly, I wouldn't. There are a couple of reasons for that. One is some of you are probably struggling to get the low D to come out. It's a tricky note. It's a little more resistant when you get a few more fingers down. It's also just really hard. It's really easy. It's really hard to get your air kind of low and slow enough. I really recommend lots of space. Like I'll put my finger in my nose and drop my jaw all the way down to that knuckle. You know, it takes that much to get the air to really go into the flute. Also, this is sort of a weird little aside, but this is the first place on the foot joint. It's the first place that the flute goes out of adjustment. Looking at this, wondering if it's out of adjustment. So it's a little less stable down here, so sometimes these keys aren't closing all the way. So honestly, repertoire-wise, your kids aren't going to see those pieces that use low C sharp and low C for years. It's going to be a really long time, so I feel like you don't need to do that. If you can get them solid down to the D, life is good. Move on to something else that seems a little more relevant in their lives. I wouldn't worry about it. Just so you know, I'm just going to show you this again. If you're looking at your own flute, you probably notice that you have 2 keys right here, and I have 3. So this is kind of a step-up flute thing. It's an option for more kind of advanced, more expensive instruments to have this low B foot. I would say if you looked around, well, as if we were able to do that, you looked around with other, flute majors in the building, you would see they all have these low B keys here. The standard flute is the low C, but it's becoming really common with kind of more expensive, more advanced instruments to have the low B. None of this is really relevant to your life. If you can get it really solid down to the low D, you're doing great. So the issues in sound production generally have to do with getting the air to go in the flute, getting back here, I think getting more space kind of top to bottom in your teeth. If your teeth are together, if your low notes sound like that, it's probably because if your teeth are together, there isn't any air going into the flute. Remember, the jaw's job is to get air to go down into the flute. So now I'm going to say, like I asked you a question and you didn't know the answer. Where were you last night? All right, so this big drop here, especially between the back teeth. Big difference, right? Yeah, so a lot of air going into the flute. The hard part, and I know many of you have experienced this already, is if you blow and you get kind of, that happens a lot. We try to play a low D and we get kind of this sound of a ghost, whistling, if you get that, your temptation, you're like, oh, I should blow harder. And then you get the next octave up. So remember, this is a great time to remind ourselves that all the fingerings are based on the harmonic series. So the low register is the fundamental. And then the middle register, which will be in the next video, the middle register is the octave up. So we have a couple of different fingerings, but mostly repeated fingerings that reflect the harmonic series, because then the next interval up is the fifth, and then we're in the high register. So the main thing is to remember that blowing harder, while it feels like the right thing to do, it's not actually the right thing to do. You want to actually make more space here. Like you're saying, I'm really a big fan of, The other thing that happens is when you say, you're making the inside of your mouth bigger, and that slows your air down. So making a larger aperture is one way to slow the air column down, but it's not the only way. Having a bigger space, especially tall space. The other thing that can happen is when you have a really big air column, if it gets really wide, we're back to my head joint with the platinum riser right here. If my air is kind of fanning across the flute and I'm not really splitting it on that edge, then that's just a bunch of air that isn't going anywhere that's going to help you make a sound. So let me play like that so you can hear that. That's the sound of, I don't know, I'm getting a little dizzy thinking about it, but like 70% of my air going over and not into the flute. So now I'm going to think about bringing the air in so it's kind of the width of that platinum riser right there. But I'm going to go ahead and make tall space, that nose to jaw. So yeah, a lot more air going into the flute that way, so you get a lot more sound. Okay, let's see what I forgot to say from all these notes that I wrote and didn't read. Okay, low notes can be more challenging. Some of you have experienced that. Generally, it's about getting air to go into the flute. The jaw is really, really critical for that. We talked about what the first note is. We have multiple fingerings for B flat. I would just lay off the B flat thumb key until we've established a clear difference between B flat and B as being uniquely separate notes in the scale. And then when you introduce playing in keys, that would be a great time to go, oh, look, we have this other way to play B flat if we're in B flat major. And there are no B naturals. Life is good. So let's see, low register, slower air, keep the jaw dropped. Oh yeah, one last thing I did forget. So we talked about the lower lip kind of covering the whole, and it'll cover somewhere in the vicinity of a third to half of the whole. You're going to cover a little bit less. Let's see if we can get this in here. Oh, this is weird. So I'm going to cover more now. Yeah, I can't see that very well. So I'm actually sort of bringing my lower lip back just a little bit for the low register. I don't know if you can see the lower lip coming forward. Let me do that again. Just watch the lower lip. When I go to the higher G, I'm just overblowing. I'm making the air faster so you can hear the higher G. Then that's when the lower lip comes forward. So I'm actually covering a little bit more of the whole as I go higher. So if you're having trouble with the low register, you might kind of try to look in the mirror. I'm having trouble looking in my screen. But and see if you can maybe cover slightly less. Low C, C sharp, we don't care about those right now, or low B. All right, that's the low register. Thank you. See you next time.